I want to welcome everybody to our HR Roundtable meeting today. I am Shannon Latham with the Olathe Chamber of Commerce, and we are still doing these via Zoom. Hopefully by sometime later this year, we'll be able to finally see each other in person. But until now, this is a great way to get everybody together and hit on very relevant topics. I think this today is super interesting because we had a great turnout and RSVP for this meeting. We have Tammy Somogye, hopefully I said that right.
Somogye.
Somogye, thank you.
All right.
Joining us with Lathrop GPM, and she concentrates her practice on educational employment law, representing educational institutions, municipalities, and businesses. And she works with elementary school, or school districts and colleges on several topics that are day-to-day issues for them that they deal with that you don't even think about as a parent that she advises them on. And she advises groups regarding a broad range of employment issues that arise, such as background checks, employee discipline and terminations, Family Medical Leave Act, unemployment compensation appeals, workers' comp appeals, wage and hour issues, and discrimination and harassment complaints. We know she's a great person because she is a Jayhawk. I saw that on her bio. And we are recording this today. If anybody's interested, if you miss any of this or you have to go off, we will have it on our website later this week. And I will also send out her contact information. And Tammy asked that if you have any questions, please put them in the chat. And she most likely get to them at the end, just in case she somehow gets around and answered it. But she'd prefer to answer them at the end through chat. So if you have any questions, reach out through the chat and I will turn it over to Tammy.
Thank you very much for inviting me to present today on this topic. I know everyone is super excited about the prospect of a vaccine, and then employers are, okay, now that we may have one, what can we do? So the million-dollar question is, can employers require employees to get vaccinated? The Equal Employment Opportunity Commission issued some guidance in December of last year that doesn't answer the question precisely, but by addressing a range of issues that are raised by employers who adopt mandatory vaccine policies, the EEOC does strongly suggest that employers can indeed require employees to get vaccinated. Now, keep in mind that the EEOC guidance is not law, but courts may defer to the agency's interpretation of the law in certain circumstances. So we can consider it persuasive authority, but it's not absolutely binding. So now that we know that an employer can require an employee to get vaccinated, or employees as a general matter to get vaccinated, should employers require employees to get vaccinated? I think actually that's the $2 million question, because there are a whole host of issues that are related to having a mandatory vaccination requirement. One issue is that the vaccine currently is emergency use authorization only. And how does that impact employers' decisions in requiring a mandatory vaccine? I think it's important to understand what emergency use authorization, or EUA, means. According to the FDA, that means it's a mechanism to facilitate the availability and use of medical countermeasures, including vaccines, during public health emergencies such as the current pandemic. Under an EUA, the FDA may allow the use of unapproved medical products or unapproved uses of approved medical products in an emergency to diagnose, treat, or prevent serious or life-threatening diseases or conditions when certain statutory criteria have been met, including that there are no adequate, approved, or available treatments. Taking in consideration input from the FDA, manufacturers decide whether and when to submit EUA requests to the FDA. Once submitted, the FDA will evaluate an EUA request and determine whether the relevant statutory criteria are met, taking into account the totality of the scientific evidence about the vaccine that is available to the FDA. So why does this matter to you? Why do you care? Because the COVID-19 vaccines are being given in the context of an EUA, the FDA requires that those administering the vaccine inform the recipient that he or she has the option to accept or refuse the vaccine. And if the employee refuses the vaccine and is ultimately terminated because he or she is not vaccinated, the employee could then file a lawsuit claiming retaliatory discharge. This type of claim would assert that public policy protects an individual's right to refuse the vaccine. That's what they were told when they were given the option to have it, right? You can refuse this. You don't have to take this. And that the sole reason for the termination was because that person exercised that right. And of course, there are defenses to that type of claim. The employer could argue that the adverse action was driven by the employer's duty to provide a safe workplace, not necessarily the employee's exercise of a right. But both the arguments on the employee side and on the employer's side are untested and will be costly to test. No one wants to be the test case on this kind of thing. And so it's one consideration in thinking about, do we want to have a mandatory vaccine requirement or a voluntary one? Another thing to consider is, has the vaccine been made available to employees? At this point, as you know, we have a phased-in approach. If my employer required me to get the vaccine in order to work, I wouldn't be able to do it because it's not offered to me right now. And so that's, a consideration too. So no one should be doing, frankly, right now, no one should be doing a mandatory vaccine policy effective today because not everyone can have it. You're going to have yourself with a lot of employees who can't get access to the vaccine. The next question to consider or issue to consider is, does vaccine administration constitute a medical examination that violates the ADA? Because as you may know, the ADA generally precludes employers from requiring employees to undergo a medical examination except in limited circumstances. Luckily, the EEOC has, in its guidance, has concluded that administering a vaccine is not a medical examination under the ADA. So this is carved out from the typical medical examination prohibitions. So that's a good thing for employers. The next question to consider or issue to consider is whether a vaccine mandate requiring an employee to provide proof that she or he received the vaccine, does that in and of itself constitute a disability-related inquiry that violates the ADA? And again, the ADA generally precludes covered employers from requiring employees to respond to disability-related inquiries except in limited circumstances. And here, the EEOC has been gracious in guiding us that requiring proof of the vaccine is not a disability-related inquiry. So that's good. However, other aspects of a vaccine policy, such as inquiring why an employee did not get vaccinated, may generate ADA compliance issues. If an employer requires employees to provide proof that they've received a COVID-19 vaccine from a pharmacy or a healthcare provider, you run the risk of the pharmacy or the healthcare provider providing more information than you need to know besides that the person got the vaccine or didn't get the vaccine. So if you're going to require proof, then it is a good idea to warn the employee that the healthcare provider or the pharmacy only provide information as to the verification that they got the vaccine, not any other additional information. There's actually some guidance in the law. There's a notice, a sample notice language to include in either a policy or a notice to employees, so that if you provide employees that notice and more information comes back than what you asked for, then that will be deemed to be an inadvertent violation of the Genetic Information Non-Discrimination Act, GINA, which is another thing that we need to be careful of when we're thinking about vaccinations and getting information about people's medical information. If an employee refuses to share whether or not he or she was vaccinated, that could possibly be a reason for termination. But you would need to work through the facts and circumstances unique to that particular situation to evaluate risk associated with that decision. You could have a situation where someone engaged in protected activity, or they filed a workers' compensation claim, or they have complaints of sexual harassment asserted at the time that they refused to give you the information about whether or not they took the vaccine. So you need to take all those facts and circumstances in consideration when deciding your next move, because it could be considered to be retaliatory in nature for these other things that are going on. So there's not a hard and fast rule. Hey, they won't share whether or not they're vaccinated. There's not a hard and fast rule as to whether or not that is justifiable for termination or is not. I just recommend that you look at the facts and circumstances as to what's going on, and then make that decision. And then also treat similarly situated employees similarly. So if you've got people in a certain department who are absolutely must have the vaccine, and they won't tell you one way or the other, then you treat those employees the same as to whether or not that's a terminable offense. We can't be treating similarly situated people differently. All right, next question next issue that an employer should consider in determining whether or not they want to have a mandatory vaccine policy is what do you do if an employee says that he has a disability that prevents him from getting the vaccine? That is essentially a request for a reasonable accommodation, an exemption from the vaccine mandate because of the employee's disability. So you cannot automatically reject the request for any employee or immediately terminate the employee for violating the policy. Instead, you need to engage in the interactive process with each and every employee who makes the request. Don't assume that you know about that employee's condition. Don't assume that that employee is making it up. Don't assume that there's no other accommodation that could be acceptable for that employee to do that job. Engaging in the interactive process each and every time, even if the people have similar medical conditions, is important, because that's what the EEOC requires us to do when we have people requesting accommodations. So things you can assess, how often is the employee in close contact with others? Do they work in a closed room and nobody gets to them, but maybe once a day or something? That might impact whether or not it's reasonable to allow that person not to have the vaccine. Can the employee work in an isolated workspace? Say they don't now, but could we make arrangements for them to work in an isolated workspace? Possibly. Could the employee work remotely? That's a really interesting question nowadays too, because so many companies have been allowing people to work remotely. And then you get into the situation, the argument will be, but I was allowed to work remotely during the pandemic, and so I should be allowed to work remotely now. I think employers can respond to that in part because the remote work was initially put in place as a temporary measure because of this emergency pandemic, and the shutdowns and things. And so, there can be a response to that. But you do really need to consider, can the person work remotely? You're not required to assign any of the essential functions of the job to someone else so that employee can work remotely. So there are just a number of things that you need to think about and evaluate when you've got somebody who says, I can't have a vaccine because of my disability. Other things you might consider are, does the employee interact with the public? And you have no way to know whether those individuals are vaccinated. Would a leave of absence address the concern? Sometimes people might have a temporary disability or a disability that with a leave of absence and treatment can resolve itself, and then they might be able to get the vaccine. So that might be a reasonable accommodation depending upon the length of the leave. What else you've got going on, the heightened work the tasks on the employee's to-do list, and whether you have other people who can step up and handle those things. So that's something else you'd want to consider. In addition, Is there any equipment or auxiliary aids that could address the specific disability or that would allow that person then to be able to get the vaccine? And then you're going to want to ask also how much risk is posed to others if the employee is exempted from the vaccine requirement. And so, you know, we may not know if that person is the only person in your environment who isn't vaccinated, and that person is not interacting with the public. It might be a reasonable accommodation to allow that person not to be vaccinated. But you just have to evaluate it on, you know, the facts and circumstances as they present themselves at the time the request is made. It is key that the EEOC's guidance states that employers cannot exclude the employee from the workplace or take any other action unless there is no way to provide a reasonable accommodation, absent undue hardship, that would eliminate or reduce risk to the unvaccinated, or sorry, so the unvaccinated employee does not pose a direct threat to the health or safety of others. So if this unvaccinated person poses a direct threat to the health or safety of others, based on all the things that we're considering, we can't give an accommodation because they're public facing, we have no idea whether others are vaccinated. You know, we've got, there are just too many unknowns, and we believe that there is a direct threat. Then you might be able to either terminate the person or work through some other kind of arrangement. And I think it's really important to tread lightly here because you want to avoid a claim that you're, you know, terminated them on the basis of their disability or because they refused the vaccine on the basis of their disability, because those are easy, you know, discrimination claims to make. Whether or not they're easy to prove is a whole other thing. But it is important that we tread lightly when we're considering eliminating someone or terminating someone's employment because they have a disability and cannot get the vaccine. In addition, if you're going to be relying on the undue hardship exception to a reasonable accommodation, you need to have documented all the factors that you considered in coming to that conclusion, so that if an employee does complain, you can demonstrate to the EEOC, here are the things that we considered and the data we reviewed to come to the conclusion that this is too expensive or this is unreasonable for some other reason. So that is really important when you're thinking about the accommodation process for folks who have disabilities. You may also get requests not from someone who is disabled, but from an employee who says that their sincerely held religious belief prevents that person from getting a vaccine. Title VII requires covered employers to provide accommodations to employees who object to a requirement or practice based on sincerely held religious beliefs. And so you would need to approach that person asking for an exemption or an accommodation like you did the interactive process with the disabled employee, so that you can figure out, is this a reasonable request to allow this person to be exempt from the vaccine requirement. In addition to those things, as if they weren't enough, you also need to be thinking about whether or not an employer can administer the vaccine themselves. I don't know if we have anyone here from the doctor's office or from a hospital, or you have somebody on site who, you know, is a nurse and can administer the vaccine. It's something that you really, I recommend that you avoid, honestly, because although you could, as an employer, administer the vaccine, it really, that action adds substantially to compliance duties and risks to your business. Any vaccination related questions or inquiries have to be job related and consistent with business necessity. You know, there are certain questions that someone who's administering a vaccine would have to ask to make sure that it's safe to administer the vaccine to that person. And then the company is on notice of things that that employee might say in response to those inquiries. And then also, you might get information that you aren't supposed to have in violation of the Genetic Information Non-Discrimination Act. And so really, it is in everyone's best interest to have someone else administer the vaccine, even if you're going to have a mandatory vaccine policy. Another thing to think about with respect to a mandatory vaccine policy is that there may be potential labor relations issues with that decision or that policy. Even if your employees do not belong to a union, if they coordinate resistance or work together to protest the requirement to have a vaccine, those actions would be protected by the National Labor Relations Act, and the employees will be protected from discipline due to their protests if they meet certain criteria. So we need to be really careful. A lot of employers don't realize that the National Labor Relations Act applies to them because they don't have a union workforce. The National Labor Relations Act does apply to non-union workforces as well, which would allow employees to, for instance, talk about how to make the workplace better, to talk about pay, to talk about their working conditions, and then really also to oppose this type of policy. So you want to be careful that if you've got a group of employees who are congregating to, or objecting as a group, that we not retaliate against them for doing that. If you do have union representation in your workforce, a mandatory vaccination program would likely be a subject of bargaining with the union, unless the agreement provides management with broad rights to develop such policies on their own. There is an emergency exception to the mandatory bargaining rule, but the National Labor Relations Board has rarely allowed employers to rely on this defense. So an employer should go in with eyes wide open if they choose to issue a mandatory vaccine policy in the union environment without bargaining with the bargaining unit. Another thing that employers have been asking is whether they can encourage vaccinations through wellness program incentives. A lot of companies, I know mine, has a deal where if you do certain things, get a health risk assessment and, jump through certain hoops, get a certain amount of points, then you can have a lower premium, or you can, you get certain benefits. And so it's possible that you might be able to encourage vaccinations with a wellness program incentive, but you need to, again, tread lightly and tread carefully if you were to do so. Because when an employer offers a wellness program incentive, federal law requires that the employer offer a reasonable alternative to employees who elect not to participate in the program due to a qualifying disability or sincerely held religious belief. And it's not clear right now what a reasonable alternative would be for those folks, but we may be getting guidance from the federal government on this issue soon. There are just so many things that we can't anticipate or know because this is such a novel situation and we're all learning as we go. Certain types of wellness programs can only offer de minimis incentives for employees, so you'd have to think about what type of incentive, how much the incentive is worth or valued at. So you need to, really consider that. In addition, if the wellness program is tied to the employer's group health plan, you can have more generous perks than otherwise would be allowed. So again, you have to just think about how you structure it. And here, although wellness incentives are often considered taxable income to the employee, the COVID-19 vaccine may actually qualify for an IRS exclusion as medical care. So there would be a tax issue you'd need to think about too when determining what incentive you'd offer to the employee. My purpose today is to spot a whole bunch of issues for you, so that if you're thinking about, okay, do we want to have a mandatory policy? Here's a whole bunch of reasons why we might want to put the brakes on that particular idea. If we do want to have a mandatory policy, however, what sorts of things do we need to think about and consider before we, make that conclusion? There were several questions that were submitted before the presentation, which was helpful because I was able to think about them and come to try to get some consensus from others in my group and other experts in this area. One of those questions is whether an employer can require an employee to sign a waiver that they're not liable if the employee does not get vaccinated and contracts COVID-19 while at work. Waivers are not recommended from employees because of our workers' compensation obligations, and most likely it wouldn't be enforceable anyway. So you would have, a false sense of security, I think, if you had such a waiver. What we've been doing from the very beginning of the pandemic is perhaps requiring employees to sign an acknowledgement of the risks associated with working in person, or so that they understand what's going on. And that may be an effective alternative here too, acknowledging risks of working without being vaccinated. That might be a viable alternative instead of the waiver. We've just found that a waiver is not going to be enforced, and an acknowledgement at least gives you something to rely on for the employee to come, keep the employee from coming back later to say, well, no one ever told me. Yes, we did, and here you signed it. You acknowledged that this was a potential risk. So that I wouldn't recommend a waiver, but maybe an acknowledgement. The next question that was posed is, does an employer have to have a vaccination policy? And if so, does it have to be in the employee handbook? I don't think that you are, certainly no, you aren't required to have any policies unless the law requires you to have one. Sometimes it's a good idea to have policies, even if the law doesn't require you to have one. Like certain things, for instance, you must have a sexual harassment policy because the law requires you to have one. This does not fall in that same category, but establishing clear recommendations, clear expectations is recommended so that your employees know what it is that you're expecting them to do. There's nothing worse than, do we have to do this? Do we not have to do this? No clear explanation of what the employer requires. If you do have an employee handbook, then typically all employment-related policies should be included in that handbook or as an addendum to it. So if you don't want to republish the whole entire handbook, you can do an addendum to the employee handbook, identify what the policy is, and then have folks acknowledge receipt of that change or that addendum. And then next time when you do your employment handbook, publish it again, you can include that policy. Another question that we had was, should a job description be updated to include vaccination as a requirement? This was a great question and something that I hadn't really thought about. And so one thing that I considered when considering this question was that I do not recommend that you amend your job descriptions until the emergency acceptable use is gone and the vaccine is widely available. Because if you change your job description to require vaccination of people who cannot get vaccinated or who want to wait to get vaccinated until after it's approved under the normal circumstances or that EAU designation is removed, then I just think that it's really important that you wait, be patient for those things to occur before you put it on your job description. The other thing that you need to think about is whether the vaccine or being vaccinated is job related and consistent with business necessity. For someone whose job duties involve working remotely, they don't interact with anyone ever. is that really job-related and consistent with business necessity to require that person to be vaccinated? So you'd want to think about who it really might apply to. And then also looking, I think now more than ever, even though we're not going to be adding that COVID-19 vaccine to our job descriptions right now, I do think it is important that we evaluate our job descriptions to make sure that all of the components of what you actually require that person to do are included in the job description, and that you don't have things in there that no longer apply to that employee. Because when we get back to the world of, where we can actually do these things in person and people are returning to the office environment on a more wide basis, you're going to have people who are going to request remote work. And so you need to be prepared to explain why remote work was a temporary solution. It wasn't something that we can support full time. And to the extent that you have things in your job description that demonstrate, interaction with others or in-person contact, things, that demonstrate that work needs to be done in your office, then that will help you. If you, like say you have, you're missing an essential requirement of the job in your job description, and that's the thing you rely on to say, no, we can't accommodate a request for, working from home. And then, the person files a complaint and you're called upon by the EEOC to provide information, including they always ask for the job description in a disability case. You provide the job description and you insist that there is this one requirement that has to be done in person, but lo and behold, it is not on the job description. That's going to look like discrimination, like you are creating a reason to discriminate against this employee. You're creating a cover-up for the real reason for the decision not to accommodate. And so that would be problematic for you. So I would recommend that everybody look at their job descriptions really routinely, not just, for this purpose, but look at your job descriptions, review them on a routine basis so that you can ensure that they are consistent with what the person is actually performing for your business. All right, let's see, I had another question. If a position requires travel and an unvaccinated employee cannot meet airline requirements to show proof of vaccination, is that grounds for termination? I'm going to give my favorite lawyer answer to this question. It depends, because it does depend. What is the reason for not being able to be vaccinated? Is it a disability? Is it a sincerely held religious belief? We have to know why it is that they're saying they can't be vaccinated or refusing to be vaccinated. Maybe they don't give you a reason, and that's, again, something that you need to consider. You'd also need to think about what's the proximity of the destination. Are there alternative methods to get there? Could the person take a train? Could the person take, drive? If it's from here to Chicago or here to St. Louis, right? Is there a reason that they couldn't take some alternative mode of transportation that would not, require the vaccination? And so, you have to think outside the box a little bit. We can't just be closed-minded and say, oh, because they can't present this to the airline and they can't fly on a plane, then they can't possibly do this job. Then also thinking about, are there any accommodations that can be made? Again, we in our firm have suspended travel, for a long period of time, and still cannot travel. And so we've been doing a lot of, client meetings with folks in other states and other countries via Zoom. And so would that be a reasonable accommodation going forward for that employee who can't get vaccinated because of a disability or something of that nature? And so, you need to just really think about it before you dig in your heels and say, oh, because this person refuses to get vaccinated and they can't go on a plane, therefore we have to terminate their employment. That may be appropriate. I'm not saying that it won't be, but again, you need to look at the facts and circumstances and really evaluate the risk associated with making that termination decision, depending upon what's going on with that particular employee. I had a question about whether an employer can require wearing a mask in the office if CDC guidelines recommend it until herd immunity is reached. Certainly an employer can require mask wearing even if the CDC doesn't recommend it anymore. If that's what you want your employees to do while they're in your employ because you think that's the best way to minimize risk of exposure to COVID or the common cold or the flu or whatever else we give to each other, that's perfectly fine for you to make that determination and for you to require mask wearing, even if the CDC doesn't recommend it anymore or says it's not necessary. That's just a requirement of your employment environment, and that's perfectly okay. Then I had a few questions about whether a business could require visitors to be vaccinated. I think this is a little bit outside my area, but my guess would be probably, but even businesses that have folks coming, the public coming to them, have an obligation to make reasonable accommodations for those who have a disability. They have to make their places of public accommodation accessible to people with disabilities. And so if you exclude someone because they haven't been vaccinated, and the reason they haven't been vaccinated is because of their disability, that person is going to file a complaint or a lawsuit saying that they were denied access to your establishment because of their disability. And so again, that needs to be really considered. And that doesn't just apply to vaccinations. It would apply to any types of things. I mean, no shoes, no shirt, no service. Those are usually pretty good because folks oftentimes their disability does not prevent them from wearing a shirt or clothing or wearing footwear. If you're going beyond that and requiring certain things to happen before a person can go to your establishment, you may have to make accommodations for people who have disabilities. I had another question about whether for in-person events, can you state that attendees are there at their own risk? I think yes, you could, but it may not be valid for all claims. You may want, just like you go to the ballpark, well, when we used to be able to go to the ballpark, right? And you have the ticket and it says on the back of it that your attendance at this event, is acceptance of the risk associated with, with anything that may occur there. Sometimes those are valid and sometimes they're not. So I wouldn't take it as an ironclad, I'm going to have a defense, even if something happens, there's not going to be any exposure here. You could require someone to sign a waiver, a non-employee to sign a waiver to participate in an event. But you won't know whether it's valid until they challenge it, and then you have to defend it in court. Having that waiver doesn't prohibit or doesn't keep you from having to also provide a safe environment for employees. So you still got to provide a safe environment for those in it, if your employees are attending. And so, I recommend that you, in addition, if you're going to do a waiver for attendees to a public event, I think that you should also still take steps to make sure that your event is following whatever applicable rules, like mask wearing, if that's a requirement of the state where it is being held, or the county or the city where it's being held. Those things are important because if someone does try to challenge your waiver, you can demonstrate, look, we took all of the steps that were required. We went above and beyond what was required. Everybody was 10 feet away instead of 6 feet away, just trying to demonstrate all the safety precautions that you took in order to try to make that event safe. All right, let me see, I got some more questions here. Would I have a sample of an acknowledgement or language I could share? I'll have to look. I don't have it off the top of my head. It's been a while since employees were requesting or employers were requesting us to draft an acknowledgement. But really it's, I mean, I think just off the top of my head, it's things like, you understand the risks associated with COVID-19 transmission, those sorts of things that the CDC has on its website about, if you're within a certain, there's an increased risk of contracting COVID if I'm within 6 feet of someone, or if I'm not wearing a mask, or those sorts of things. And so you would just want to include those things, and I can look also and see if there's some kind of language that I could share offline later, but I don't have the language off the top of my head. Let's see. And then the next question was, are we aware of a timeline for the vaccine to come off of the EAU usage to be fully approved? I am not aware of a time frame. Personally, I don't know how those work, or how long they intend to have that in place. I think it probably has to do with the scientific requirements. How many people have been in the trial? How long have they been in the trial? What's the data associated with the trials? And so I'm sorry, I don't have an answer to that question. Let's see, next question. Can you require employees who do not get vaccinated to wear masks while allowing those who have been vaccinated to not wear a mask, assuming that there is no longer a mask mandate? I would want to be very careful with that idea, because it depends. If the people who are not vaccinated are not being vaccinated because of their disability, right, then the employee is going to say, you're only requiring me to wear this mask because of my disability. If you have like a carte blanche policy, anyone who's not, and you do it before anybody asks, right, about accommodation for a vaccine exemption. If you start out that way, we encourage everyone to be vaccinated. Unvaccinated employees will be, regardless of the reason, will be expected to wear a mask, for their protection and the protection of others. You might be able to get away with something like that. I really need to think about it, but you want to treat similarly situated employees similarly. And I know that if people who are unvaccinated are unsimilar to people who are vaccinated. However, they perform the same job functions. And so say you've got someone who, again, who works in an isolated space, who doesn't interact with employees. They happen to be somebody who's not vaccinated. And are we going to require that person to wear a mask, but nobody else in the building because everybody else is vaccinated? So I think it depends on the facts and circumstances. I haven't really had a lot of time or consideration to think about that, because we have had a mask mandate that has been in place for quite some time. But I would think that again, the vaccination is also not bulletproof and does not necessarily prevent someone from spreading the virus. I think I read last week that there was somebody who got the vaccine and then a week later tested positive for the virus. And so, it's just a tricky thing. And so, that may be for something way down the road once this is all under control. And we may have more information at that time about what the risk of transmission is once we get, the majority of the people vaccinated. So I don't have a definitive answer to that question, but I would caution and just be really careful when making that decision down the road. Any other questions?
Say, feel free to either type them in the chat, or if you want to unmute yourself, you should be able to ask Tammy. We have recorded this today, so we will add it to our website later on this week when we get a chance. So if you need to refer back to it, because it was a lot of information, but very useful. Looks like, I would say I don't see any other questions popping up. Want to thank you very much for joining us today, Tammy.
Sure.
And that was, I think, very useful for a lot of people. We've asked, people have asked, and it will be recorded, so I will add it on there. And I will also send out Tammy's contact information if there are follow-up questions that she can help you out with or refer you to the correct person. If it's something that she can't answer, or if it's something that's not even possible to answer at the current time. Thank you all for joining us. And I think if that is all the questions we have, we will get out of here a few minutes early today.
Thanks so much for the opportunity to present to you. And
Yes.
If I can be of help to anybody, just let me know.
Thank you so much.
Take care.
Thanks, Tammy.
Sure thing.